The pyramids of Giza have long stood as a beacon for the ingenuity and persistence of early man. As time moved forward, these enormous structures remained motionless, forever casting their shadow over the developing cities of the Nile. Egyptologists suggest that all three of the Giza pyramids were built during a particularly busy 60-year period, from 2550 to 2490 BC. It's also said that each of these pyramids was built by a different pharaoh, the smallest being the Pyramid of Menkaure, the middle, the Pyramid of Khafra, and the largest, the Great Pyramid, was built by Khufu. Whilst these are certainly the most famous of the pyramids, they're by no means the only ones. Sources have identified at least 118 Egyptian pyramids, and approximately 80 Nubian pyramids were built in the ancient kingdom of Kush, located further up the Nile in modern-day Sudan. Official scholars suggest that the oldest Egyptian pyramid is the Step Pyramid of Djoser. Made primarily from limestone, this pyramid can be found amongst many others in Saqqara and was said to have been constructed around 2650 BC, 100 years before the pyramids of Giza. Saqqara is a vast necropolis belonging to the city of Memphis, the capital of ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom. It's the largest archaeological site in the whole country and is home to 11 individual pyramids. As well as the pyramids we see today, there are many sources which identified pyramids which no longer exist, or as official sources say, never existed at all. One example are the pyramids of Moeris, which can be first found mentioned in the work of Greek historian Herodotus. Rising in the 5th century BC, Herodotus claimed that in the center of Lake Moeris stood two pyramids, rising around 90 meters above the surface of the water and extending down just as deep. On top of each of these pyramids, he placed a colossal statue sitting upon a throne. Claims similar to those made by Herodotus were later repeated by others, such as Diodorus the Sicilian and Pliny the Elder. In 1245 AD, an Arabic writer reported that the tops of the statues had been partially destroyed in the search for treasure. In 1672, a German theologian wrote that he could only make out the remains of one statue, and by the time an English travel writer visited the site in 1737, only the bases remained. Even though the statues are accepted by mainstream academia, the pyramids they supposedly sat upon have never been found, and as such, have been attributed to the imagination of Herodotus. Herodotus also claimed that the lake the pyramids sat in was artificial, having been flooded by King Moeris diverting the Nile 900 years earlier. This too is disputed by academia, who claim the flooding of the Fayum oasis happened naturally over time. There are other examples of missing pyramids, such as the many described near the cataracts of the Nile. Near the ruins of Aswan, one source claimed to have seen a 1400-foot pyramid encased entirely in black stone. At a height larger than the Empire State Building, such a pyramid would be pretty hard to miss. But officially, no pyramids have ever been found in Aswan at all, aside from the small pyramid of Elephantine Island, located slightly further up the Nile. If you visited Egypt before, you might recognize the name Aswan. That's because it's home to the ancient Aswan Quarry, where the famous unfinished obelisk still lies today. It was from this quarry that megalithic obelisks weighing over 1,000 tons were carved from the rocks before being loaded onto boats and sent down the Nile to their permanent destinations. Even inside the Great Pyramid itself, we will find granite blocks which were quarried right here in Aswan, around 900 kilometers away from the Giza Plateau. So what were the pyramids for? Well, I'm sure it doesn't need to be said, but the mainstream narrative is that the pyramids were built as tombs, solemn epitaphs for the ego-driven pharaohs of the early dynasties. But their purpose has been the center of debate amongst alternative historians for generations. For example, author and engineer Christopher Dunn suggested that the Giza pyramids were actually a form of ancient power plants, writing that the air shafts were used to inject chemicals into the heart of the pyramid, where a reaction would take place, generating electromagnetic energy. Others have suggested they make use of vibrational mechanics and have a positive effect on people or objects placed within the structure. For example, it's been said that blades can be sharpened, or even that plants grow faster when kept inside a pyramid, although Egyptologists disagree, saying there is no scientific basis for these claims. Either way, the Great Pyramid itself has been the focus of abounding theories. How was it built? What functions might it have served in ancient times? How many hidden chambers lay waiting to be discovered? And most importantly for today's video, who actually built it? From a mainstream academic perspective, that question has already been answered. The Great Pyramid was commissioned by the pharaoh Khufu, the second king of the 4th dynasty, who ruled around the year 2550 BC. It was built in about 20 years and consisted of gangs of laborers numbering in the tens of thousands. The mummified pharaoh Khufu was then placed in this pyramid upon his death, with a number of items he'd need in the other world, such as treasure, furniture, and clothes. On the other hand, many researchers point out the fact that no pharaoh's body has ever been found inside a pyramid, and neither Khufu's remains nor any of his funerary equipment was located within his. The official explanation is that the pyramids had been looted many times over the years by grave robbers and treasure hunters, and as a result, the bodies had most likely been stolen or destroyed. But to author and researcher Scott Creighton, something still didn't quite add up, and what he found led him to write the book, The Great Pyramid Hoax. The only direct physical evidence which connects Khufu to the Great Pyramid are some red painted marks supposedly found by British explorer Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse. The colonel claimed he found these markings inscribed on the roof and walls of a series of 4 hidden chambers, which had been sealed since the pyramid's construction. These hidden spaces are known as stress-relieving chambers, and as the name implies, are supposedly intended to redistribute the weight of the stones above the king's chamber. Some researchers reject this hypothesis, pointing to the Queen's chamber and the fact it does not contain stress-relieving chambers, even though there is more weight pressing down upon it than in the king's. Among the markings found in the hidden chambers are what Egyptologists claim to be the various names of the pharaoh Khufu in hieroglyphic form. It's important to note that when Herodotus wrote of the builder of the Great Pyramid, he called him Cheops, and when Manetho wrote some 100 years later, he called him Pseuphis. Historians agree that these 2 Greek names refer to the same person, and after Jean-François Champollion seemingly cracked the hieroglyphic system in 1822, the name Cheops or Pseuphis was transliterated into the hieroglyphic form of the name Khnum-Kuf, and its shortened version, Khufu. When these names are contained within an oval shape, it's known as a cartouche. Cartouches for both Khnum-Kuf and Khufu were said to be found in several of the hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid discovered by Vyse. However, these markings were not the neat and precisely sculpted versions I've just shown you, but were instead crudely painted in a cursive style today known as Old Hieratic, a shorthand script used for everyday communication in ancient Egypt. The red paint used to make these markings was made of iron oxide ochre, mixed with water and a binding agent such as fish oil, egg or honey. This simple paint, known as mogra, was still being made and used in Egypt in 1837, during the time of Colonel Vyse's expedition. As the study of hieroglyphics progressed, it was realized that not only did these chambers contain the full and abbreviated cartouches for the pharaoh, but also a third name had been inscribed onto the walls of these hidden spaces. This name became known as the king's Horus name, and importantly, this name had not been contained within an oval cartouche, which in the 1830s was the only way for the king's name to be recognized. It's now well known that a pharaoh could have as many as 5 different names, but during Colonel Vyse's time, this was not fully understood. Either way, with multiple names of the king being painted across different sections of the hidden chambers, Egyptologists believe they now had enough evidence to confirm that the builder of the Great Pyramid was indeed Khufu. This was also backed up by what appeared to be the markings of the various work gangs who had quarried the individual stone blocks. These are sometimes known as quarry marks or workers' graffiti. Within the hidden chambers, 3 distinct quarry gang names were identified, although the precise translations remain uncertain. In the 1900s, some people started to question the authenticity of the markings, including Zachariah Sitchin, who claimed they had been painted onto the walls of the chambers by Colonel Weiss and his assistants. Sitchin claimed that the forger had used an incorrect hieroglyph, one which denoted Ra, the supreme god of Egypt. While Sitchin was never allowed to visit the chamber himself, he claimed to seek out the original drawings of the markings which were stored in London and confirmed the errors in person, saying they made the name Rufu instead of Khufu. However, Sitchin was incorrect. The original markings in the chambers do seem to contain the correct spelling for Khufu, and when Sitchin's forgery claims were discredited, many authors such as Graham Hancock and Robert Bovell, who had previously supported him, quickly distanced themselves from his work. However, the idea of forgery might not be so ludicrous, but not for the reasons Sitchin suggested. For example, it is now known by viewing evidence from his private journal that during his time in Egypt, Colonel Weiss had foreknowledge of the symbols and clearly knew how the exact cartouche should be written. Although curiously, Weiss never mentions this fact in his published work. Now in 1837, it was understood that the builder of the Great Pyramid was named Pseuphis in Greek. And therefore, if anyone wanted to fake his name, they'd have to pick the correct cartouche which translated directly into Pseuphis. This would be an impossible task for the average person. A forger could not risk placing an incorrect cartouche, as it would eventually be found out. There was only a handful of people in the world who possessed the necessary knowledge to select the correct translation, such as British academic Sir John Gardner Wilkinson or Italian Egyptologist Ippolito Rossellini. In 1832, 4 years prior to Weiss's expedition, Rossellini had published his work Monuments of Egypt and Nubia, in which he accurately identified the cartouches of Khnumkuf and Khufu with the Greek Pseuphis. As someone who was going on an expedition to Egypt to specifically prove that the pyramid was built by Khufu, this is a book that Colonel Weiss would have definitely owned. It also offers a possible explanation as to how he had prior knowledge of Khufu's cartouches, as shown in his private journal. However, before we can condemn Weiss, we must first examine all the evidence. The arguments Egyptologists offer in defense of Colonel Weiss can be summarized as follows. Number 1, the names. 3 types of Khufu's name can be found within the chambers. 6 mostly complete occurrences of his full name Khnumkuf. 1 complete occurrence of his abbreviated name Khufu, and 4 occurrences of Hor-Megeddu, his Horus name. Considering in 1837, most people were unaware that pharaohs could shorten their names or have up to 5 different royal names, scholars say it would be unlikely that Weiss would correctly forge 3 separate names which all relate to the same king. Number 2, the Horus name. In 1837, nobody knew about the Horus name, which was not written within an oval cartouche. The theory goes that during this period, people believed the king's name to only be written within a cartouche, and therefore, Egyptologists say, it would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, for a forger to recognize an alternative name for the king, and then reprint that mark within the chambers. Number 3, the difficult angle. Some of the quarry marks, or workers' graffiti, can be seen within the small gaps between the tightly fitting blocks. They say it would have been impossible to paint these marks after the blocks had been placed, and resultingly must have been painted before or during the construction of the pyramid. Number 4, the gang names. Egyptologists say that the work gangs had different names, and each name was always linked to specifically one of the pharaoh's 5 names. And these were never mixed and matched. They say it would have been impossible that a forger would have known about the specific pairings of a gang name to the kings. So, if we're going to accuse Colonel Weiss of forgery, we're going to have to counter these points. We already know Weiss would have probably had access to Rossellini's work, which accounts for his knowledge of the Khufu and Khnumkuf cartouches. But what about the Horus name? It has been proposed by researchers that Weiss must have stumbled upon, or perhaps was given, a secret cache of authentic hieratic texts, which were found outside the pyramid. Old Kingdom inscriptions would have included various gang names of which the Khufu cartouches form a part. This secret cache would have also contained other inscriptions, such as Khufu's Horus name, Hor-Megeddu. Thanks to Rossellini's book, Weiss would have been able to identify the Khufu cartouches and would have presumed that all the inscriptions contained within this cache were related to Khufu. Therefore, it was safe to reprint all of these inscriptions inside the chambers, knowing they were probably associated with King Khufu. So before we continue, let's ask a pertinent question. Why would Colonel Weiss want to fake the name of Khufu inside the pyramid? And to answer that, we're going to need to learn a little about him. Born Richard William Weiss on July 25, 1784, he was the only son of General Richard Weiss. In 1800, at the age of 15, he joined the 1st Dragoons at the lowest officer rank and went on to enjoy an illustrious military career. In 1801, he transferred to the 15th Light Dragoons as a lieutenant and a year later earned himself promotion to captain. More promotions came in the years following, becoming a major in 1813, a lieutenant colonel in 1825, colonel in 1837, and finally major general in 1846. As a member of the ruling class, Weiss was a very wealthy man, and in 1812, at the age of 28, he took on the additional name Howard, which allowed him to inherit multiple estates in Northamptonshire from his grandmother. Most of Weiss's privileged life was spent at his country estate and mansion in Buckinghamshire, enjoying the pomp and luxury of the elites in the Victorian era. Despite his long military career, it seems his passions lay elsewhere, notably in his religion and in archaeology. But his interests were placed on the back burner as his family were deeply involved in politics, with both Weiss and his father serving as members of parliament. His political career was not without controversy. In 1807, at age 23, after winning a parliamentary seat by a suspiciously large margin, one of the other candidates presented a petition to Parliament charging Weiss with electoral fraud. Weiss denied any wrongdoing, and fortunately for him, the charges were rejected by Parliament. However, it seems clear that the petition should have succeeded, for it is now known that over 90% of the votes Weiss received had been obtained with monetary bribes. This fact was only revealed some 60 years later as part of another investigation into parliamentary corruption, and this shone a light on the sheer scale of Weiss's electoral manipulation. During his time in Giza in the 1830s, he and another colonel were accused of using fraudulent means to obtain a permit to excavate the pyramids at Giza, which had seemingly been issued under the name of Italian Egyptologist Captain Giovanni Caviglia. Weiss wrote about these allegations in his public work, but never divulged the name of his accuser, with some suggesting it was Captain Caviglia himself, who had a falling out with Weiss after helping him obtain the fraudulent permit. It's clear from Weiss's private writings and published work that he was desperate to make an important discovery in the land of the pharaohs. His statements suggest he was becoming more frantic as his expedition wore on, and surprisingly, from his writings it would appear that he did not consider his discovery of the 4 hidden chambers to be of much importance. This is supported by the fact he kept using gunpowder to blow through to the next chamber, writing that he was hoping to find the true burial place of Khufu. As mentioned earlier, no king has ever been found inside a pyramid, and Weiss wanted the ultimate honor of finding the first. It would have earned him the sort of international acclaim that fell upon Howard Carter some 90 years later in 1922, when he discovered the intact underground tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of Kings. Ultimately, Weiss would be disappointed. After discovering and opening 4 hidden chambers in the upper reaches of the Great Pyramid, he found no sarcophagus, no pharaoh, and no treasure. By the end of his expedition to Egypt, Weiss had spent £10,000 of his own money, which in today's economy would be around £1 million or around 250,000 Big Macs for the Americans. Despite failing his objective, Weiss's time in Egypt did yield some results. He found a range of artifacts, many of which he sent back to the British Museum in London. Had he succeeded in his main quest, then he would have undoubtedly proven that the pyramid was a tomb. Yet Weiss seemed keen to not only find a body, but find specifically the body of Khufu, to prove that he was the builder. But why was he so obsessed with this? We mentioned earlier that Weiss was a religious man. He himself was the great-grandson of the Bishop of Lichfield, and in 1837 the religious and scientific climate was very different from today. The church had a much firmer grip on the throes of society, and it would be another 22 years before Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged the authority of the clergy. This was a time when messages took weeks to travel, long before the advent of radio and 20 years before the first transatlantic telegraph cable. Photography was in its infancy, the vast global network of railways we see today was only just starting to be put down, and the Christian church held powerful sway over the European countries. Speaking of Weiss's faith, Leonard Cottrell said he was a deeply religious man with a profound faith in the literal truth of the Old Testament. This is exhibited by many of Weiss's comments in his published work where he references the Great Flood. For example, speaking of the pyramids, he said, "Many of those noble monuments were raised in very early ages, certainly not long after the deluge." It's clear from his comment that he believed the deluge to be historical fact, and the pyramids built not long afterwards. It's also suggested he would have believed in the literal creation of the Earth in the year 4004 BC, which was the accepted date for creation during the 1830s. It's from this strong religious conviction that we start to see a possible motive for fraudulent activities in Giza. After all, a pyramid couldn't possibly be older than the creation of the Earth. The Catholic Church were themselves not too trustworthy with new information. For example, earlier we mentioned Champollion, the man who cracked the hieroglyphic system in 1822. Well, the Catholic Church actually funded his only trip to Egypt in 1828 on the condition that he would never reveal anything that would contradict the teachings of the Church. Evidently, the Catholics had a niggling fear that discoveries in Egypt might contradict their narrative, and it's likely this same fear reverberated some 7 years later when Weiss visited the Great Pyramid. What if he discovered something which changed the accepted chronology? A physical object or a piece of language which predated the biblical flood, or perhaps even creation itself? What might such a discovery mean for the authority of the Church? On the other hand, if Weiss were to prove Khufu the builder of the pyramid, then it could not have existed before the flood or before the creation of the world. That would make the Catholic Church very happy. Weiss actually makes this point very clear himself when he wrote in his book, "A cartouche might be found which would determine the age of the constructions." This conveniently is exactly what he went on to find. As you can see, there are 5 so-called stress-relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. The first of these was opened in 1765 by Nathaniel Davison and is named after him. Out of all the many people who visited Davison's chamber, including Captain Caviglia, who lived inside it for a period, only one person has ever reported seeing any markings. That was Zahi Hawass, the former Minister for Antiquities in Egypt, who undertook a photographic study of the chamber in 1996, but suspiciously never made the photos public. On the other hand, we have reports from at least 6 contemporary sources, including Davison, Caviglia, Colonel Weiss and his assistants, who make it clear that there were no markings in the first chamber. Why is it that out of the 5 hidden chambers, the only one to not contain marks was the one opened by Davison 72 years earlier? All 4 of the chambers opened by Weiss and his team contain markings, including Khufu's cartouches and relevant workers' graffiti. Yet none of this is present in the first chamber. In fact, none of this has been found in any other chamber in the pyramid at all, except the ones opened by Weiss. In 1993, a German engineer designed a robot small enough to traverse the southern air shaft. After a 200-foot journey up the shaft, a block was discovered which prevented further travel. This block became known as Gantenbrink's door, named after the engineer of the robot. In 2002, the robots returned, this time with a Pyramid rover. This machine was attached with a camera and drill, which allowed it to bore a small hole in the blocking stone at the end of the shaft. It sent back images showing a small gap, and then a second stone a few inches beyond the first. Finally, in 2011, a new robot made the same journey fitted with a flexible endoscopic camera, allowing it to capture images from inside the cavity. The camera picked up mysterious red-painted symbols located on the floor of this tiny chamber. Egyptologists, including Zahi Hawass, have suggested these symbols resemble the numbers 1, 20, and 100, written in Old Hieratic script. However, if we examine these symbols side by side, we can clearly see they differ substantially. This discovery also raises bigger questions for Colonel Weiss, as he discovered hieratic numerals in Campbell's chamber, the highest chamber and last to be opened. This chamber is almost level with the cavity where our mysterious symbols were found, and as a result, would have been constructed around the same time and by the same workers. Yet we find two different styles of hieratic numerals. In a construction project as vast as the Great Pyramid, it would have been important to keep uniformity in measurements, and therefore it's unlikely that two varying versions of the same numerals would have been used on site. Due to the location of this cavity chamber and the necessity for the robots, we can safely presume that this area of the pyramid has been sealed since its construction. Therefore, we can assume these mysterious symbols are authentic. Why do we not find similar symbols in any of the stress-relieving chambers? It's worth noting here that when Weiss opened Wellington's chamber, he reported seeing marks which he claimed were unlike any other painted hieroglyph he'd seen across Egypt. The Wellington chamber was the first chamber to be opened by Weiss. The writing he found there was the first writing to be found in any Old Kingdom pyramid at Giza, and as such, Weiss would have known the historical importance of such a discovery. He documented the opening of this chamber in his published work, The Pyramids of Giza, describing an empty space devoid of any life. There were no doors, and the only stone found on the floor in the room was from the blast to get in. Weiss deduces that the room is a stress-relieving chamber and describes a thick layer of black sediment covering the floor, which blackens the faces of those who enter, comparing it to London's fog. At the end of his description, he says, "Perring and Mash having arrived, we went in the evening into Wellington's chamber and took various ad measurements, and in doing so, we found quarry marks." From this, we can see that the marks were found on the second visit to the chamber, which took place on the evening of the day it was opened. Oddly, Weiss does not provide any details of the marks in his published work. This is strange because, as we discussed, these are the first writings to be found at all in any of the Giza pyramids, and therefore would be worthy of discussion. However, he did order his assistant to make a drawing of the marks that they'd found. Mr. Hill made drawings of the cartouche found on the west wall, whilst the other assistant, Perring, made drawings of quarry marks found on both the east and west wall. We can observe Perring's drawings and see on the east wall a small bird alongside some geometric shapes, and on the west wall a gang name that bears the royal cartouche of Khnum Kuf written in hieratic script. Curiously, the marks on the east wall do not seem to resemble the typical ancient Egyptian hieratic symbols. Considering that Weiss never mentions discovering any other marks at a later date, we must assume that all of the marks in Wellington's chamber were discovered at the same time, and therefore must be what Weiss was referring to when he said in his published work, "We found quarry marks." However, his private diary paints a slightly different picture, in which he writes, "In Wellington's chamber there are marks, like quarry marks of red paint, also the figure of a bird near them, but nothing like hieroglyphs." Curiously, Weiss's private diary makes no mention of any recognizable cartouches. It only seemingly mentions the marks found on the east walls, the ones drawn by Perring, and makes no mention of the west wall, where the royal cartouche was found, and of the symbols he did find, he described them as nothing like hieroglyphs. So, there's only two real possibilities. First, Weiss simply missed the royal cartouche on the west wall and found it after writing his diary entry, but strangely, he did not record this second discovery in either his private or published work. Considering this was his specific goal, he would have surely written about it. For example, "Day 2, I've found the cartouche, my mission is a success," but we don't get anything like that. The second explanation is that the cartouche simply wasn't there yet. When Weiss recorded in his private diary of his findings, the only symbols present were on the east wall, which weren't hieroglyphs. Then sometime after, he decided to add the cartouche himself to the west wall and neglected to write about it for obvious reasons. After this, Weiss went on to blow through into 3 more chambers, and what he found he again described as quarry marks. Among these quarry marks, Weiss would find a number of other cartouches for Khnum-Kuf and 1 complete cartouche for Khufu, but again he only describes them as quarry marks. This is strange because Weiss explicitly stated he was searching for a cartouche to date the pyramids, and he also draws and refers to the cartouche of Khufu multiple times in his private field notes. He definitely knew what a cartouche was, and certainly knew what the Khufu cartouche should look like, thanks to Rossellini's book. And yet, upon discovering the royal cartouches, he still describes them in his published work as quarry marks. Researchers have suggested he is intentionally downplaying his own knowledge of the subject and feigning ignorance of the historical significance of his finds. At the beginning of the video, we mentioned Zecharia Sitchin's claims that Colonel Weiss had faked the markings with the help of his 2 closest assistants, Hill and Perring. Most of Sitchin's accusations were debunked, but one curious avenue of investigation was opened. 3 years after Sitchin published his original claims in the book Stairway to Heaven, he received a letter from Walter Allen of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Mr. Allen claimed that his great-grandfather was an eyewitness to the forgery, saying that after researching his own family in 1954, he had discovered his ancestor to be Humphreys Brewer, someone who worked with Weiss and his team at Giza in 1837. Allen created a logbook of his discussions with elderly relatives and received several of Humphrey's letters. At the bottom of the logbook in 1954, he writes, "He joined a Colonel Weiss exploring Giza pyramids. Had dispute with Raven and Hill about painted marks in the pyramid. Faint marks were repainted, some were new. Did not find tomb." Allen's account further states, "Had words with a Mr. Hill and Weiss when he left. He agreed with a Colonel Colin Campbell and another Gino Cabilia." This 1954 logbook clearly names the key players at Giza in 1837, including Captain Giovanni Caviglia. It seems a dispute broke out amongst the explorers due to the repainting of old marks and the creation of entirely new ones. Skeptics have suggested that Humphreys Brewer did not exist due to the fact that Weiss or his assistants never mentioned him, and went even further to accuse Walter Allen of lying. However, this obituary from the Watkins Express dated January 16, 1868, clearly shows him to be a real person who visited Egypt in his early life. A 1977 Pittsburgh Press article also shows that the Humphreys Brewer is an ancestor of Walter Allen, who arrived in America in 1849. Therefore, it's likely the real reason for Brewer's exclusion from Weiss's work is due to the argument they had over the faking of the hieroglyphs, as described in Allen's logbook. Although Brewer's name does not appear in Weiss's published work, author Scott Creighton tracked down Weiss's original handwritten journal and claims the name Brewer does in fact appear multiple times, although he admits it's difficult to read due to Weiss's cursive writing style. Skeptics have also suggested that Sitchin and Allen were in league somehow, and that Allen had falsified the necessary documents to back up Sitchin's claims. However, Sitchin always claimed that Weiss was assisted in his cover-up by Hill and Perring, his 2 closest assistants, whereas Allen's ancestor Humphreys Brewer identifies the culprits as Hill and Raven. Raven himself was barely mentioned in Weiss's published work, and therefore it is unlikely that Allen would choose to name him as a culprit if this document was a falsification. Furthermore, if he was truly conspiring to reinforce Sitchin's claims, then why wouldn't he have named Hill and Perring rather than Hill and Raven? The final defense that skeptics offer is that the painting of marks mentioned in Allen's logbook was actually referring to the naming of the chambers, in which Weiss instructed his assistants to paint the names of each chamber onto the walls. This is rather ludicrous though, as Brewer would have been aware of British notables such as the Duke of Wellington and wouldn't have referred to the writings of their names as marks. There's also the fact that these chamber names had only just been painted in thick black paint and therefore would require no repainting and definitely wouldn't have been described as faint marks. Therefore, it's fair to deduce that Allen was not talking about chamber names and was referring to the repainting of faint marks which had been found in the chamber, as well as the addition of entirely new marks which hadn't been present before. As already stated, Weiss opened 4 of the 5 chambers. The top 2 chambers contain many more marks than the lower 2, and the lowest, opened by Davison, contained none. The official narrative says that the quarry marks were placed onto the blocks before they were transported from the quarry. That's why, we are told, the many marks found in the various chambers take on all manner of orientation, some appearing upright to the observer and others appearing at various angles. This is because the quarriers had no idea of the positions the blocks would be placed in, and therefore there should be no uniformity in their orientation. This also means that gang marks should not cross over between blocks because they were made separately. When we examine the marks found in Campbell's chamber, we can see them labelled A to E. The granite blocks represent the floor, and each of the first 3 marks are written on separate wall sections, whilst marks D and E share a block. We can immediately tell that the size of the symbols varies and seems to be correlated to the amount of free space available between the floor and the wall block. For example, there's much less surface area to work with on block A than there is on the block shared by D and E, and as a result, the text in block A seems to be smaller. The sizing of these symbols to fit in the available spaces would suggest the marks were painted after the blocks had been placed. Even more curiously, in the mark labelled C, we can see that this makes up part of a gang name which is The Gang, the White Crown of Cnum-Cuf is Powerful. However, the cartouche element of this name is not present on the block. Due to an ancient Egyptian writing convention known as honorific transposition, the only place the cartouche could appear is either above or to the left of the symbols we can see. The cutting of the block, however, shows it would have been impossible to place this cartouche in either of those places, which would immediately suggest this mark was painted by someone who had no knowledge of ancient Egyptian writing conventions. Egyptologist Alan Rowe's drawing of the symbols seems to suggest that the mark labelled B is in fact the remnant of the royal cartouche, as shown by the dotted line. However, this would mean the cartouche was painted over 2 separate blocks, which, as we mentioned earlier, was not the practice, and could only have happened if they painted the blocks after they had been placed. Earlier in the video, we spoke about the arguments that Egyptologists used to defend Weiss, one of which was regarding the placement of marks between tight-fitting blocks that they say would be impossible for a forger to do. They used this as evidence to authenticate all symbols found within the chambers, neglecting the fact that all of the king's names are conveniently printed in easily accessible places. These gaps between the blocks are about an inch or so, and therefore they say it would be impossible for a forger's paintbrush to fit between the spaces. Independent pyramid researcher Dennis Payne has offered an explanation. He says that using 2 thin boards or stiff card and some string, you could easily fake these marks. The process is simple. Cut the string and stick the pieces to the board with an adhesive, making sure to shape the string to match the symbols you wish to print. Then the forger would paint over this string with red ochre paint, which was still available in 1837. This board could then be slid between the gaps in the blocks, and using the second board to apply pressure, would stamp the symbols onto the stone. To all observers, it would appear as if these marks had been painted on before the blocks were placed, due to their apparent inaccessible nature. So, we get the impression that the marks shown in Campbell's chamber appear to have been painted in situ. Let's look at an example from Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, where we can see what appears to be symbols wrapping around the floor blocks. The symbols labelled number 1 seems to follow the contour of the sloping granite block, and number 2 is much more level, making use of the available space. Another example from the same chamber shows more symbols seemingly wrapping around the granite floor blocks. If we're correct and these marks were painted in situ after the blocks had been placed, we have to question whether it's the work of a forger or simply the way the Egyptians decided to paint it. If this was the work of an innocent Egyptian painter, then why would his symbols be painted in such difficult places? Surely he'd have the entire block faces to work with and therefore would use them. But inside the chamber we see many symbols which appear to be semi-concealed by the placement of other blocks. This would imply the forger was purposely trying to give this impression. The forger understood simply painting complete symbols onto the block faces would be suspicious, and as a result has attempted to make the forgery look as convincing as possible. Another example of this is the frequency of orientation. Out of some 40 blocks with markings, only 3 are placed upright for the observer, and the rest are at varying angles of 90, 180, and 270 degrees. Logic dictates that statistically you'd expect around 25% of the markings to be facing upright, but we find only 3. This could suggest that the forger was trying too hard to make a convincing illusion. Curiously, Egyptologists say that a specific gang would have been in charge of each wall, and therefore we should find the same gang name on those blocks. But that's not what we see, as across all the chambers, the south walls contain 3 different gang names, implying they were constructed by 3 different gangs. That means that whoever painted these marks seems to have had a lack of knowledge of the practices of Egyptian pyramid building. Then there's also the slurry. When the pyramid builders were moving the blocks into place, they'd use a mixture of lime and water as a lubricant. This slurry has overflowed as the roofing blocks have been placed and has dripped and dried on the walls of the chambers. Coincidentally, the chambers with the least slurry on the walls have the most markings, and there doesn't seem to be any examples of markings underneath the slurry. If these markings had been painted before construction, then surely we'd see at least some of them being covered by this lime slurry. The granite floor blocks also lack any form of marking, which would suggest that whilst the workers of the limestone in the Giza Plateau were busy placing their marks on every block, the granite quarriers of Aswan did not do the same. Whilst this itself doesn't mean the limestone quarry marks were fake, it does raise important questions. In Weiss's private journal, we find he drew the Khufu cartouche at least 3 times, and every time he drew it, it was displayed horizontally. This is strange because for every other cartouche found in his journal, he draws it with their actual orientation, as in the way it would be viewed for a normal upright observer when they found it. If we were to stand upright in the chamber, observing the cartouche, that's how he drew it. What's strange is that the Khufu cartouche found in Campbell's chamber is orientated vertically and not horizontally as depicted in his journal. That means this is the only cartouche that Weiss recorded in which the orientation drawn didn't match the way it was found. Weiss's assistant Hill also made 28 facsimile drawings of the markings found within the differing chambers. It is apparent from viewing these drawings that he signed his name at the bottom of the page as a way of indicating the correct way to view the document. That means that if his signature is at the bottom of the page, then you're viewing the drawing as Hill viewed the markings in the chamber. Cross-examination of 24 of these drawings shows this to be the case, with Hill drawing the symbols in the same manner as Weiss, the way they would be viewed from an observer standing upright in the chamber. With the Khufu cartouche in Campbell's chamber, however, Hill has 2 drawings which show it as being orientated horizontally, when, as we said earlier, it is in fact vertical, just like we find in Weiss's journal. Scott Creighton says this is the smoking gun, the evidence that the Khufu cartouche was not found in Campbell's chamber but must have been found elsewhere, somewhere where it was displayed horizontally. He says, armed with this information, the forgers would have placed the symbol onto the walls of Campbell's chamber at a 90-degree angle to make it look as if the mark had been painted on at the quarry and the block rotated during construction. A closer inspection of the Khufu cartouche also reveals a thin pencil grid has been drawn either over or under the paint. If it is over, then it's more recent than the markings and could have been drawn by anyone since the chamber was opened in 1837. If the pencil goes under the paint, then that would be a clear indication that the cartouche is fraudulent. Unfortunately, researchers haven't been allowed access to examine this theory. What's even more curious, in 2014, 2 German researchers removed a small sample of the red ochre paint from one of the markings in the chambers, hoping to carbon date it. Unfortunately, the sample size was too small to date, but what they did find has some worrying consequences. The laboratory was able to deduce the chemical composition of the immediate subsurface of the paint, that is, the surface the paint was attached to. Instead of finding calcium carbonate, which is limestone, the material the blocks are made from, they found a layer of calcium sulfate, known today as plaster. There's also debate about the cartouches found in Weiss's journal, with the Khufu one seemingly containing 2 staff-like signs rather than the chisel we see printed on the walls of the chamber. Scott Creighton says that a gang name with the two staffs would actually indicate destroyers or burners of Khufu, which would seem strange. But if we look at what Herodotus said, he claimed that Khufu was so hated by the entire Egyptian population that he refused to be buried within his own pyramid, for fear that the people would desecrate his remains. This would indicate that these gang names were not the creators of Khufu's temple, but seemingly the ones who burned or destroyed him there. So, after all we've examined today, what are your thoughts on the topics discussed? Was Khufu truly the builder of the Great Pyramid? Were Colonel Weiss's discoveries of symbols and cartouches in the chambers legitimate? Or did Weiss and his assistants, Hill and Perring, or Hill and Raven, purposely implant the cartouche of Khufu into these chambers? And if so, what were their motives? Were they influenced by personal greed and acclaim, a wish to have their names cemented in the history books, or was it something deeper? Was Weiss motivated by his religious views to hide or alter evidence which might have contradicted the biblical narrative, as seen with the Catholic Church and the funding of Champollion some 10 years earlier? Today we have no fear labeling sites such as Göbekli Tepe as 11,000 years old, but in 1837 this would have been seen as blasphemy. This was a time when the Church taught that the creation of the world took place on Saturday 22nd of October 4004 BC at 9 AM. So the question is, was the fear that the pyramids might predate such an event enough to push Weiss and his colleagues to fraud? Let me know in the comments down below. Today's video was inspired by the work of Scott Creighton in his book The Great Pyramid Hoax. A lot of the arguments made can be found there with a more in-depth examination of the subject matter, so if you'd like to dive deeper into this topic, that's the place to start. I hope you've all enjoyed this short journey into the validity of the dating of the pyramids. If you did, then please like and subscribe and throw a little word down in the comments section to let me know what you thought. If you'd like to support the channel and bring more episodes like this, then there is a few ways you can do so. The best way is the Patreon, which costs $2.99 a month, and it gives you access to my private Discord server. So a big shout out to all my current supporters, and I'll see you all on the next episode of Ancient Historia.